Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into an analysis of a tragic fire, but this is really a story about what happens when the very fabric of a society gets put to the test.
159. That's the number of people who died in the Wang Fuk Court fire on November 26, 2025 in Hong Kong. Just let that sink in for a moment. But you see, the source material we're looking at today makes a powerful argument. It says this disaster, which was actually the city's worst in over 70 years, didn't just burn down a building. It ignited something way more abstract, a full-blown crisis of trust. So let's really get into this.
Okay, so to really understand what's going on here, we have to start with the first reality of this story, the physical disaster itself. What actually happened on the ground?
So this fire, it burned for over 40 hours. Can you even imagine? It started on the outside of the residential building and just climbed. It shot right up the structure, basically turning the whole building into a giant chimney.
So you have to ask, right? How does something like this even happen? Well, the source points to this, just catastrophic cocktail of problems. You've got highly flammable stuff all over the building's exterior. We're talking insulation foam, plastic safety netting, even bamboo scaffolding. And to make a terrible situation worse, witnesses said the fire alarm system was totally silent in those first critical moments.
Now, on the surface, this looks like a pretty clear-cut case of, regulatory failure, right? But this is where our source material says the story splits. This is where that second, much more complicated reality kicks in.
So let's follow that thread, because this tragedy didn't happen in a vacuum. The fire wasn't just seen as a terrible accident. It was immediately viewed through a completely different lens, a lens shaped by everything the city had just been through.
And what the source explains is that in the specific context of Hong Kong post-2019, after the national security law came into effect, this disaster became more than a disaster. It became, really, an unavoidable stress test on whatever trust was left between the government and the people.
And that test, it really came to a head almost immediately in the response to the fire. This is where you see two completely different ways of seeing the exact same event just collide head-on.
In most disasters, there's a pretty standard playbook, right? Official responders arrive, and then the community steps in to help. But at Wang Fuk Court, that whole pattern got flipped completely on its head.
People just didn't wait for instructions. They started organizing themselves, showing up with water, with food, with whatever supplies they could carry. The first question on everyone's lips wasn't, "Where's the government?" It was, "How can I help?"
And this is where things get really fascinating, because you're seeing the core conflict play out right here. From one point of view, a sociological one, this is amazing. It's a beautiful sign of a strong, resilient community. But if you look at it through a security lens, those exact same actions look very different. Gathering crowds, distributing supplies from aid stations, suddenly that looks a lot like the logistics of a protest.
And so what happened? Well, according to the source, these citizen-run aid stations were quickly cleared out by the authorities. And it wasn't because they weren't helping. They absolutely were. It's because they were seen as a potential setup for instability.
So here's the crucial takeaway from all this. This clash, it wasn't just some simple misunderstanding in the heat of a crisis. No, the source argues this moment revealed something much bigger. A fundamental and honestly pretty dangerous shift in the city's entire social contract. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. The whole matrix of meaning had changed. The simple act of people helping their neighbors, something that will be celebrated anywhere else on Earth, was suddenly not seen as simple volunteerism anymore.
Yeah. In this new reality, the default way of thinking had shifted. The source suggests that even the best intentions were now being overshadowed by even the slightest possibility of political action.
And that's when you realize the deepest damage from this fire wasn't the charred building. It was the damage to the foundational trust that holds a society together. That unspoken agreement that when things get really bad, we're all on the same team.
And so we're left with the source's final, really haunting question. It's a question that goes way beyond the ashes of this one building. When the simple act of helping your neighbor becomes a suspicious one, what is it exactly that holds a society together? Because those invisible structures, that trust, that's a whole lot harder to rebuild than any building.
Let's dive into something that, on the surface, just doesn't make sense. How does a completely normal act of citizenship, something you or I might do after a tragedy, suddenly become a crime against the state?
It's a story that tells us so much about a fundamental shift in a city's mindset.
Okay, look at this. On one side, you have a compassionate, totally understandable action. A student starts a petition after a deadly fire. On the other side, an arrest for sedition. The gap between these two is just massive, and figuring out what happened in that gap, well, that's what this is all about.
So that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth did the line move so much, so fast, that a simple request for answers could be seen as a threat to national security? To figure that out, we have to rewind the clock a little.
And it all starts with what our source material calls the ghost of 2019. Because you see, to understand the reaction to a fire today, you first have to understand the memory of a citywide protest from the very recent past.
Now, this idea is absolutely key. The ghost of 2019 isn't just about what happened during the protests. It's about the memory, the lingering feeling that for the city's security services, that year never really ended. It became a permanent pair of glasses, a lens that shapes how every public gathering, every online petition is now seen.
So just a quick refresher. It all started in 2019 over a single bill, but it blew up into this massive movement about the entire future of Hong Kong. Now, the key takeaway from that time, from the authorities' point of view, wasn't what do people want? It was how do we make sure this never, ever happens again? And that single question led to a brand new security-first way of thinking. Which brings us right here, to what it's like to live in a city after an uprising. We're going to explore the real-world, day-to-day consequences of that new security mindset. This quote from the source is just, wow, it's so powerful. Think about what that actually means. It suggests this permanent state of alert, this feeling that society is always just one wrong move away from another huge disruption. It's a city that's constantly holding its breath. And this slide, well, it lays out the new security playbook perfectly. Everyday civic activities get a completely new label. A spontaneous crowd gathering to mourn someone, that's no longer seen as just a crowd. It's a potential risk. A network of volunteers organizing supplies, that's not charity anymore. It's potential mobilization infrastructure. And a public memorial with flowers and notes, that's viewed as a spot for spreading messages. And here's the most crucial part. Even something as basic as community compassion gets reinterpreted. That human instinct to come together, to help, to demand answers because you care. That instinct itself is now viewed with suspicion. It's seen as a potential spark that could start another fire. Which brings us right back to where we started. With all of that as background, we can finally understand the new red line, that moment when a student and his petition crossed it.
So, after a devastating fire at a building called Wang Fuk Court, this student, Miles Kwan, he did something that in most places would be called, well, good citizenship. He saw a terrible tragedy and he tried to do something constructive about it.
I mean, just look at what his petition was asking for. An independent investigation, a review of safety rules, accountability, support for the victims. Do these sound like the words of someone trying to start a revolution? Or do they sound like the reasonable requests of a citizen who wants to stop another tragedy from happening? And he was not alone. The petition got over 10,000 signatures, and it got them fast. This wasn't some fringe idea. This was clearly a feeling that a lot of people in the community shared. And right here, this is the collision. What is, by almost any measure, a totally routine act of civic engagement, it's not even a protest, just a petition, is seen through that post-2019 security lens. And through that lens, it doesn't look like civic duty. It looks like a threat. This slide shows us exactly how much the definition of danger has changed. The old red line, it was pretty clear. Organizing big protests, calling for action in the streets. But the new red line, it's way, way blurrier. Now, just demanding a transparent investigation, or asking for accountability, or even just questioning the official story can put you on the wrong side of it.
So this leads us to our final and maybe most critical question. What can be questioned? Because when the line moves this much, it affects absolutely everything.
You know, when a government starts treating a call for accountability like it's a call for insurrection, it sends a really powerful message. And the lesson people learn is a chilling one. Be careful what you ask. Be careful what you question. Because the simple act of trying to find out why now comes with a potential cost. And this quote from the source, man, it just stops you in your tracks. Truth is no longer in what happened, but in what is allowed to be questioned. It suggests that reality itself is now subject to approval. The facts of what happened matter less than whether you have permission to look into those facts.
And let's just bring this all the way back down to the human level. When you apply this new logic, even the most fundamental, grief-filled question from a family member, tell us why our loved ones died, can be framed not as a cry for justice, but as a political risk. So I'll leave you with this to think about. When that simple human act of asking why becomes dangerous, what's the ultimate psychological price? What happens to curiosity, to a sense of community, and to truth itself in a city that's slowly learning not to ask? So, you've probably heard the term white terror thrown around, usually in a historical or political context. But today, we're going to look at it a little differently. We're going to break it down as a psychological phenomenon, a very specific kind of fear that can quietly, almost invisibly, reshape an entire society from the inside out.
I want you to think about something for a second. Was there ever a time you wanted to speak up, I don't know, maybe at work or in a community group, but you just held back? Not because you knew for sure you'd get in trouble, but because you didn't know. You couldn't guess the outcome, and that tiny chance of a huge risk just felt too high. That feeling right there is the key to everything we're talking about today.
Okay, so this is the heart of it. This isn't about having soldiers on every street corner. It's about an internal math that people start doing in their own heads. The real power comes from two things working together. People start censoring themselves because they know there's a line you can't cross. But, and this is crucial, that line is kept fuzzy and vague on purpose, while the price for crossing it is crystal clear and it's devastatingly high. It's that uncertainty that does all the heavy lifting.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the foundation, what we're calling a terror you cannot see. Then, we'll unpack the logic of fear. After that, we'll see how this shifts people's mindsets from citizen to survivor, compare two different kinds of social order, and finally, we'll look at the real price of silence. So first up, a terror you cannot see. This is all about how laws, things written on paper that can feel really abstract, end up creating very real, very personal fears that start to guide what people do every single day. The source material we're looking at really zeroes in on the situation in Hong Kong as a case study. You've got laws like the National Security Law and Article 23. They brought in these new super broad crimes, things like sedition or collusion with external forces. And here's the real kicker, the definitions for these crimes, they're incredibly blurry. But the punishment? Life in prison. That part is not blurry at all. And the result of that is pretty profound. A law that on paper is about protecting the state becomes, in reality, a daily calculation about your own personal safety. People who used to be outspoken, journalists, organizers, artists, they just go quiet. It stops being about what you believe in, and it starts being about protecting yourself, your career, and your family. Okay, that brings us to our second part, the logic of fear. We're going to get into the mechanics here of why this kind of system is just so incredibly effective, often way more than just using brute force. So the first piece of the puzzle is this. You don't actually need to punish a lot of people. You just have to punish a few, but you have to do it very, very visibly. A student gets arrested for starting a petition. A famous person gets detained, and everybody else gets the message, loud and clear. You don't need to threaten anyone directly. The example does all the work for you. Secondly, and this is the part that feels kind of backward, but it's genius in a dark way, you don't want clear rules. Think about it. If the law said, don't wear a blue hat, people would just not wear blue hats. But if the law is vague, people start to worry. Maybe I shouldn't wear a blue hat, or a green one. Is this scarf too political? That vagueness makes the zone of fear so much bigger than what's actually written down.
And that leads right into the final piece of the logic. The goal isn't to make everything illegal. It's much simpler. It's just to create this nagging feeling that anything you do could be interpreted the wrong way. That creates this deep-seated caution that's way more effective at controlling people than a simple list of don'ts.
So what does all this constant low-grade fear actually do to the way people think? Well, that brings us to Section 3, from citizen to survivor. This is all about that huge internal change that starts to happen. This right here is the absolute core of the psychological shift. You go from a mindset of, I will not do what is wrong, which is a moral position, right? To, I will not do anything that could be misunderstood as wrong. And that is a survival position. It's the exact moment when the spirit of a citizen, someone who's part of a community, gets replaced by the instinct of a survivor who's just trying to stay safe. Now, when this happens to a whole society, it creates a very specific kind of quiet. And that brings us to our fourth section, two kinds of order.
Because when you look from the outside, a city with no protests, no loud voices, it might look stable, but you've got to ask yourself, what kind of stability is it really?
And that question right there is everything. It forces us to look under the hood because the absence of noise is not the same thing as the presence of peace. There's a world of difference between a city that's quiet because people are happy and a city that's quiet because people are afraid.
Okay, so let's break this down. Basically, a society can go down one of two paths. In a trust-based order, people generally believe that the system can fix itself. So what do? They complain, they question, they use the proper channels, and you get a busy, active public space. But in a fear-based order, the foundation is completely different. It's the knowledge that one mistake can cost you everything. So the smartest, most rational choice is to just be quiet, to not be noticed. And the result? The public space just empties out.
This all leads us to our final and maybe most important section, the price of silence. What is the long-term cost? What is the unintended consequence of building a society on a foundation of fear? And here is the great irony of it all. The strategy ends up defeating itself. It creates this really dangerous downward spiral. First, people get scared to speak out about problems. Then, all the legitimate warnings and complaints just disappear. So what happens next? The system becomes an echo chamber. It only hears what it wants to hear. Until, finally, it becomes totally blind to its own weaknesses, to its own failures, to the huge crises brewing right under its nose.
And this brings us to one last, really powerful idea from the source material. When a system can't tell the difference between a simple complaint and an all-out rebellion, it means it has lost its most important function, its ability to listen. And a system that can't listen, well, it can't learn, it can't adapt, and ultimately it can't survive. It's the ultimate paradox. The search for total control ends up creating the perfect conditions for total collapse. Really leaves you with a question, doesn't it? What happens when a system makes itself blind? Something to think about.
Have you ever seen a tragedy like a building fire and watched it just completely spiral into a messy political fight? It seems so strange, right? But how that happens, well, it tells us a whole lot about how power works. So let's get into it.
So this is the big question we're going to try and unpack. Why on earth does something like a fire become so political? I mean, it's not the fire itself, obviously. It's everything that comes after. The questions people ask, the demands for answers, and, most importantly, how the people in charge respond.
Okay, so we're going to start with an event that on the surface seems pretty straightforward. But the reaction to it? It was anything but normal. This wasn't just about the fire. What really made it stand out was how the official response went in a completely unexpected direction.
And you can really see the difference here. I mean, look. In most places, a disaster kicks off a civic response, right? You review the building codes, the media demands answers, the public wants independent reports and fair compensation. It's about fixing the problem. But in the case from our source material, the response was viewed through a national security lens. Suddenly, petitions from grieving families were slapped with labels like political motives. Even groups trying to support victims were watched or even shut down. The whole conversation shifted from public safety to preventing a political crisis.
This huge difference in how they reacted, well, it's not an accident. It's not just a random choice. It comes from two completely different ways of looking at the world and what the role of a government should even be. Let's dig into that.
So why the split? Why does one path lead to practical civic solutions and the other leads straight to political damage control? The whole answer really comes down to the lens, the specific filter that the state is using to see what's happening.
And that brings us to the absolute core concept of this whole thing, the security lens. This is the mechanism, the exact tool that can take a public tragedy and transform it into what's seen as a political threat.
So what is it exactly? Well, the security lens is basically a worldview where every single thing that happens, no matter how unrelated to politics it seems, gets filtered through one and only one primary question. It's a way of seeing the world that puts one single concern above everything else.
And this is that question. Could this lead to instability? Now look, any government is going to worry about stability. That's normal. The problem starts when this becomes the only question that gets asked, because it pushes all the other vital, practical questions right off the table. And the consequence of this way of thinking is massive. When you look at everything through a security lens, there's no such thing as a neutral civilian space anymore. A memorial service isn't just about grief. It's a potential unauthorized gathering. A charity drive isn't just about helping people. It could be a form of organizing. Heck, even silence can be interpreted as a silent protest. Everything gets a hidden meaning.
So in that one single question, the one about stability, just dominates the entire conversation, a whole bunch of other really important questions just disappear. They get forgotten. And these are the very questions you need to ask to learn from a disaster and stop it from happening again.
And this leads to a really powerful idea from our source material. It's this: when the question of power swallows the question of competence. And that's the trade-off right there. The focus isn't on being competent anymore, making sure buildings are safe. The focus shifts to just holding on to power and control.
And the first question to just vanish is the most fundamental one of all. How do we stop people from dying senselessly? How do we make sure this never, ever happens again? Then all the practical questions get lost in the shuffle. The simple stuff about basic competence, why didn't the fire alarm go off? It's a technical question with a technical answer, but it gets buried under all the political noise.
And what about accountability? Questions like, why were cheap substandard materials used in this building? Well, those get pushed to the side too. It's just too risky to have that conversation when the main goal is to project strength and avoid admitting any failure.
And finally, the ultimate question, responsibility. Who is actually responsible for ignoring the warnings? Who knew something was wrong and did nothing? The security lens is basically designed to deflect this exact question, because admitting fault is seen as weakness, and weakness could lead to, instability.
Now, this intense focus on security doesn't just stay in government offices. It trickles all the way down, and it teaches regular citizens a set of unspoken rules about how to survive in this new environment. These are the lessons you won't find in any textbook.
What you end up with is this kind of dark, cynical instruction manual for being a citizen. Rule number 1, don't be a hero. Stepping up to help or lead a petition can draw the wrong kind of attention. Rule 2, grief is not a safe zone. Be careful what you say, because even mourning can be seen as crossing a line. Rule 3, give up on a real investigation. If you demand one too loudly, you'll be accused of incitement. And the final, overarching lesson, just adjust your expectations. Accept a reality that's sold to you as being more stable, but is also a lot quieter, with a lot fewer voices being heard.
And these unwritten rules, the ones people learn by watching and by being afraid, they don't just go away. They create this lasting mark, a kind of collective memory that shapes how society thinks and acts for a very, very long time. Our source material puts it perfectly. These lessons are never written down, but they get deeply embedded in the collective memory. They become a part of the culture. And that kind of memory, it is incredibly difficult to erase. It really makes you wonder, what other tragedies are remembered not for the lessons that were learned, but for the questions that were silenced?
Today, we're going to dive into something fascinating: how a society can change, not just on the surface, but deep down in the hearts and minds of its people. And we're going to do it through a really powerful metaphor coming out of Hong Kong, a tale of two very different fires. You hear this argument a lot when people talk about the city's recent changes. It's a pretty simple idea, right? Things are quieter, they're more stable, and hey, on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. But that very question, well, that's the real tension we're going to unpack today. So yeah, this leads us to a much bigger question. When we call a city orderly or stable, what are we actually measuring? And more importantly, are those even the right things to be measuring? Let's take a closer look. And look, it's true. If your main way of measuring is by counting the number of protests in the streets or how many viral videos of clashes you see, then yeah, the city is undeniably quieter. The volume has definitely been turned down. But what if that's not the whole story? A recent tragedy, a really devastating building fire, ended up pulling back the curtain on that whole story. It gave us a totally different picture and showed that sometimes the most important ways to measure a society's health are the things you can't easily see or count. So this breaks it down perfectly. On the left, you've got the visible stuff, the loud, obvious signs of disorder that, for the most part, are gone now. But then look at the right side, the invisible things. Do people feel free to say what they think? Can they criticize something without being scared? Do they trust that the system will work? These things are way harder to put a number on, but they tell you so much more about what's really going on. And this brings us right to the central metaphor for today's explainer. While one very real, very destructive fire was being fought, another one, a much quieter one, started to spread. So first, there was the physical fire, a real one. It tore through a building, it took more than 40 hours to put out, and it left behind all this destruction. It was a visible disaster, It had a clear beginning and a clear end. But then, there's the second fire. This one isn't made of flames. It burns inside people's minds. And unlike a physical fire, this one doesn't have a clear endpoint. it's expected to burn for a long, long time. So what exactly is this fire in the mind? Well, it's the fire of all those unspoken questions, the things you're wondering about, but you just know you can't ask out loud. It's the fire of these anxieties that are so hard to even describe. And maybe the most chilling part? It's that slow-burning feeling that even if you do what you think is right, you could end up getting punished for it anyway. So what happens in the real world when a fire like this really takes hold? It creates a city of silence. And this just perfectly shows how social trust breaks down. It happens in stages. First, a simple act of kindness, just helping someone out, starts to be seen as risky. Then, when someone expresses real pain or grief, people suspect there's some hidden political agenda. And finally, just asking for the truth gets you labeled as someone trying to stir up trouble. The very glue that holds a community together just starts to dissolve. And this is the huge paradox here. A place that was famous for being outspoken, for having the courage to say no, is now in a situation where the best way to survive is to just disconnect. The safest thing you can say is, "I'm not involved." And this really gets to the ultimate tragedy. It's not just about the lives lost in a physical disaster. It's about all the people who are still living, but who feel like they have to make themselves smaller, quieter, less visible, just to get by. That's an incredible loss of human spirit on a massive scale. And this is where the whole thing becomes bigger than just one city. It becomes a question that every society, everywhere, really has to think about. What does stability actually mean? And what's its real cost? I'm going to let this one sit on the screen for a second, because this question is really the heart of this entire analysis. If keeping things stable means we have to treat basic human decency like it's a threat, then what are we actually protecting? Is it a healthy society? Or is it something else entirely? At the end of the day, you're not going to find the real answer in some official report or a government press release. The truth? It's in the silence. It's found in that empty space, in the things people are now too scared to do, and the questions they are now too scared to ask. That, right there, that's how you find the true measure of a society.